Hi there, folks. Dr. Bruce Dichter, I should say Dr. Bruce MD here. Now, this is a new podcast. I know I promised you that I would be uh, starting history now, but developments in the last 3 days really kind of changed my schedule, which is okay by me because this one's a real humdinger. And it has to do with what is the biggest bank robbery ever recorded done publicly in history, period. That is what Donald Trump has done to us at this point. That bank robbery, of course, started with his lawsuit against the government in several months ago. Then this week, starting on Monday, they published a resolution for that lawsuit, whereas the IRS, which that type of resolution comes under Trump, would write a check for $1.67 billion to another department controlled by Donald J. Trump. That gave him an extra $1 2/3 billion to do with what he wants. He could go after people, he could use it for political support. I mean, it's absurd. It basically is stealing from the US Treasury and putting it into his own account where he's the boss. Okay? And the whole joke, a lot of the comedians would joke that Donald Trump sued himself. And so doing, made almost $2 billion. Got that? Okay? Well, that is, and settlement is really, I don't know how to describe it. Uh, it is a bank robbery. There is no other way to describe it. Now, when you're dealing, I've spent several podcasts trying to illustrate the behavioral disorder of people like Trump. And the hardest part is to ignore their words. Because let me tell you, they got a whole lot of people, attorneys, etc., cranking out language about this to try and make it sound legal, but it isn't legal. Okay? Because Trump thinks he's God and as president, he can get away with it. Anything he wants. He thinks he has found a legal way to steal this money. Got it? And if nobody stands up to him and fights it, he'll get away with it. And it is a bank theft. And the money belongs to, although it comes out of the IRS bank account, it really belongs to us. And I'd like to say a couple things about the IRS. Okay, the money they get to work with is given to them by Congress every year in the budget. Okay, and every year in the budget, the budget always has to run over, and that's true of most any places. And they have to go looking for more money. Now, if all of a sudden towards the end of that year, they run out of, because of the $1.7 billion deficit that was added in, they'll run out of the budget, the money early. Okay, where does the Treasury and the IRS get their money? From the taxes we pay. And one of the things we have to stop with that, it's always been, well, the IRS is the villain. They're always chasing us down for money, the billionaires especially. Donald Trump especially, part of his deal was this money was tax-free. They couldn't go after anybody for that money, which is a flagrant violation of our IRS laws. Now, our IRS laws are really there for one reason, because people cheat to avoid paying taxes. And really, to look at the problem, you have to kind of think and sit and say, well, what do we get for our money? Okay. And you start going through that. Where does the money go? Okay. Well, it goes to support our military. What does the military do? Do we need that? You bet we do. Okay. Why? because there's a whole lot of people in this world that want to knock us off and take over what we have. Okay? Well, the ones at the top would be Russia and Iran. Now, without the strength and the update with our military, we wouldn't stand a chance, just like what happened at the beginning of World War II. It took everybody committing everything to win that war. So, when you look at things in life, what you see is what you should be grateful for. Okay, and there's all kinds of things. Grateful for your job, grateful for your car, grateful for your family, and grateful to put a roof over their head, to eat, have enough food to eat, and maybe take a vacation a couple of weeks a year. Okay, those are the key things. There may be more I've left out. But in order to have an environment where that happens, we have to pay taxes. And if we all cheated on our taxes, there's less money to do all those things. What are all those things? Well, first, we enjoy our interstate highway system. That was built 90% by federal money, right out of our taxes. Got that? Well, I've gone back and forth across country, and I'm happy with that. I think that's tax money well spent. And when the people have to make decisions about where the money goes, we don't have the data to try and balance a budget and see who gets what. We have no choice but to let our representatives that we elect do the job. And in this case, it's the House of Representatives that controls the money. Okay? Now, the important thing in that is that all of the money that the IRS gets goes directly into the United States Treasury. Okay? And other things that we get besides military strength, we get our national parks, we get our other things like that, and we get all kinds of government programs that are necessary for the quality of our existence. Something that the people behind Trump don't appreciate. The reason is simple. They want the money for themselves. Greed is an issue. It's hard to explain, and I will get to that later in my podcast and make an attempt at least for you to see it. But at this point in time, we're in trouble. Trump and his people have come up with all kinds of arguments to tell us this is legal. Well, words lie, and boy, nobody is better at using words to lie than Trump and his cohorts. All right? They have controls, and then they have controls because they have controls in Congress. All right? If they didn't, Trump would be in trouble. Okay? They aid and abet his criminal activity, and it is criminal activity. So, one thing I want to say, I appreciate what the IRS has to do. I've always paid my taxes. I would no longer think even if I had $1 billion, I would pay my taxes, because all those people in the top 1% of the income that hold the top 1% of the money in our society only could do it because people pay taxes. And therefore, they see a pot of money sitting there and they figure out all kinds of ways that they can take it and cheat. Okay? So, sometimes you have to step back and look at what you're getting. Okay? What we're getting is security in a way that nobody else gets. What we're getting is governmental support to develop and maintain our economy. Nobody gets it as well as we do. Got that? We get governmental support for our agriculture system. We have governmental support for our merchant marines. I can go on and on. There's a whole, and they all refer to that as well. There's a whole lot of wasted money on what the government spends. Well, the only wasted money really is the money that individuals take out of it, basically steal. It happens all the time. So It's not that there's a problem with the IRS, and that what we have is a problem with Trump et al. Uh, trying to make IRS the villain so that he can slip his robbery through and nobody notices it. Got that? Okay, that's psychological manipulation. And that's common among people and politicians like Donald Trump. It's common with others, but this is the most serious one by far. So, is it a bank robbery? You bet it is. What is a bank robbery? Bank robbery, when guys go in, demand the money with their weaponry, and run out. Okay? Well, Trump's weapon, in place of weaponry, he has the position of president. And he does the same thing. He runs in by filing a suit, and then he settles the suit. That's the getaway part. Okay, once he does that, he's gotten away scot free. He's robbed the bank, which is the U.S. Treasury, and gotten away with almost $2 billion. Period. No matter how you cut it, that's what happened. Okay, and as such, he's no different than any bank robber that's robbed a bank in the United States of America going back 250 years to when we started. And we've got to understand that. We've got to start looking through the confusion and haze he and his cronies are putting up so that we're so confused on a day-to-day basis that we don't know what's really happening and we don't really see it. And that's important to know. That's hard to do. Now, as far as the confusion does, and something I like to mention is that, as I mentioned it earlier, confusion is pretty much what's in Donald Trump's mind. I don't think listening to the news and everybody making comments about, well, he seems to change his mind every week or two, and it always seems to change on Tuesday. Okay, that's because that's the way his mind really is. You know, it's full of lies. As a result, it's confusion. Most of the people who have severe disorders of this type don't function well in society. Why? Because they can't organize their thoughts. They have thought disorders, which goes with it. Okay. Now, with the thought disorder, they always produce tells. And Donald Trump is producing a lot of tells every day, in fact. You can pick them out, but he's got to be convinced this is normal. It's not. And it's almost like a classic example of the emperor's new clothes, where two con men come in when the emperor needs a new suit and go through all the motions of making a new suit, and there's nothing there. And they drape him with this invisible suit, and he goes out to show it off with nothing on but his underwear. Okay? And of course, then a little boy yells out, "Look, he's got nothing on." Okay? That's really what we're dealing with here in a grand way. And when you poke the bubble, which is all filled with confusion, you see there's nothing going on inside his head because most people with this disorder can only manipulate people. They're not smart in and of themselves. And without Trump, with people supporting him and controlling him, he couldn't function at all as president of the United States. He'd be lost because his mind is so scrambled. So he's got support from Putin, and he's got support from whatever group of people are behind him. They refer to themselves now as Republicans, but they're not. They're a bunch of greedy people who are trying to take over the government of the United States, end the democracy, and set up another system that will maintain itself so that they can maintain their bank accounts and be in that so-called upper elite indefinitely. That's what's really behind this, okay? You've got to understand that because Trump's reached a position in his disease where he is going downhill. He cannot come back to sanity. And he will find himself being addicted to war. And every time a war is cleared up, he will start inside, he may not even be aware of it, of a feeling of depressed, which he doesn't like. And so he will invent excuses to start another war, whatever the excuse is, to expand the United States, okay, to have a tariff war with China and others like them. But although the tariff war started against China, turned out to be against everybody. Okay, that was stupid. Okay, actually, that's my opinion. Okay, and it's it's a reproducible, common problem with people with this disease. Okay, at all levels, whether they be presidents, politicians, in the big corporate executive world, up in the professorships of universities, you'll find them every place. Okay, even in the military, and it's just something we all learn to deal with. And but when you get one in control of the whole country, and the worst part is, as he goes down the slope, it gets worse and worse. He's sitting there with a briefcase full of all the nuclear codes. And because he's gotten away with initiating war like he has, it's not a large step to be able to initiate war and use a nuclear weapon. Okay? That's scary. That scares the pants off of me. All right? That's the danger. And that's could very well happen if we don't stand up to him now. Now, standing up to him means one of two things. One, pushing he and his people up. Okay? Now, I don't like war. I'm a nonviolent person. I've mentioned this before. I'll probably mention it again. But there are times you can't escape a war. Because, and a perfect example is the initiation of first our Civil War. Actually, I should say first our 250 years ago, our revolution, followed then the Civil War, in which case half the South withdrew, and we had no choice but to follow up their attack with our own fight. Otherwise, our country would have gone down the drain at that point. And the next, of course, is World War II. We get our fleet bombed out in Honolulu, and then the next day, the Germans, the Nazis, declare war on us. Okay? You don't have any choice. You had to go to the mat to win that, and nobody questioned it. So now we are involved for real in a political civil war. It is important that everybody get that through their heads. Wars are different. How do we define this war or any war? A war takes place when one group of people decides they can conquer, take over what another group of people has and subjugate the other group of people to second class citizens. Got that? Now, what that means, that doesn't mean you have to shoot, because coups d'etats have happened all the time. Okay, that's the French word. Coupdetat, coup d'etat, or as you would, if you want to pronounce it our way, coup d'etat. Okay, either way, or shortened, people call it a coup. All right, and if Trump were to complete his plans along with Putin, he would have a completed coup that takes over the United States. Something I never thought would even be close to being possible. But it's real now. So we have to start, we have no choice but to draw the line, and we have to fight back. My opinion, because I don't like war, we fight back best and fastest at the polls, with the election coming up this fall. And then we take the fight to the election coming up in 2088. Sorry. And we fight like hell. And that's how we win. And we've got to bear down. And that means people who are indecisive, people have to accept the fact that we are at war. Then I tell you, Trump and his core of people who used to be Republicans see themselves as defeating us because they control Congress. And they're going to push forward. They're not going to negotiate. They're not going to do anything. They haven't negotiated since 2015. And that's because, it's the same attitude. The Japanese refused to negotiate till the atomic bomb was dropped. The Germans were the same way until they were squashed by everybody totally destroying their country. They didn't have to go down that pathway. There is no logic to it. It's stupid, okay? And there's no other way to say it is stupid. And there's nothing that can't be negotiated by two people, two sides, two parties, two countries. And each side may not exactly like the result of a negotiation, but it works. They learn to live with it, and nobody gets killed. Okay? That's what is critical for all of us to begin to accept. And unfortunately, as long as you get people like Trump et al. In power, or Putin et al., or the current party in Iran, uh, it ain't going to happen. Okay? So that will lead us to the second part of what we have to do. The second part is establishing parts of our government to prevent this from ever happening again. I guess you would say part of that, and that would be using the amendment process we have in our Constitution. And whatever we do now, we have to try. We have to stick to our Constitution. We've got to change. The amendment process is our option for change that our founding fathers gave us. And it has by and large worked. So, with that in mind, that is why it is so important to stick with the Constitution. But in order to do that, you've got to convince 3/4 of the population to go along with any given amendment, or at least 3/4 of the people in Congress. Okay? And that's important, and that's the hard part. But if everybody can understand that the end result of Trump's ruling is going to be our destruction, then we'll get together and then we'll pass the necessary amendments. Now, it's going to take a while. Okay, it might take 3 or 4 years, but it's necessary. And there's no way out of it. We may have to have conventions across the country discussing the issue. And then we have to word the amendments so that they strongly prevent these things from happening again. And we can't, and therefore it won't happen again. Now, the main thing that needs to be changed is the president's job description. I'm sorry, folks, but the job description we have was developed and ratified in 1788. Okay? Well, that's fine. It worked for that era, but the era has gotten much more complex. And it no longer really applies. All right? And as a result, we have to structure a good, proper job description for now and into the future. And that's important. I don't care if it takes from now until the cows come home. We have to do it. And we have to put all of our efforts into doing this. Otherwise, we're going down the drain. Just the way the Nazis did, just the way the Japanese did, just the way Putin's going to be doing, just the way Khamenei did, and will continue, and the Iranians will continue down the same slippery slope. And other dictators, it's the same way. So we need to hold together. If we hold together, the rest of the world will hold together, and the free world will expand. There's nothing a dictatorial society can do to interfere with free world when the free world is in control and command. Eventually, and it can be slowly, Iran is a very good example of that. But eventually, they're going to have to come around. And what helps them come around is the fact that the old guys all die, and the kids coming up want to rebel. It is normal for teenagers and college students to rebel. That's part of a healthy emotional growth as we age. And they will not like at all what their parents and grandparents did to their country, and they will start to work to make it better. But that takes time. It can take 50 years or even 100 years in this day and age because we all live so long. But it will happen. It has always happened since day one when Homo sapiens first showed up on Mother Earth. And each time we learn a little bit more and get a little bit better at this. And it's taken at least 100,000 years. And got to accept that. The same way we got to accept the fact that we have a creator up there. God exists. The creator exists. Okay? And for whatever reason, our creator has given our existence to us to do what we are doing. And that's important to understand. If we didn't have that kind of spiritual support, then we'd have collapse. Okay? And I've mentioned in the past the phoenix, okay? Wherever the story of the phoenix came from, that's our spiritual support. That's a lesson that illustrates this whole process going back 100,000 years. And we've reached a point in our history where it's time to move forward. And that's what we're going to be doing. But we have to we have to all move forward and put the old way of doing things, i.e., kings, emperors, dictators, kaisers, whatever you want to call them, ayatollahs, and move on to a more enlightened world, which I firmly believe is what our Creator's purpose is for us. And that's the way it is, whether you like it or not. Okay? If you don't like it, great. We'll all end up fighting. Everything will get destroyed, and we'll all end up living in caves like we were 100,000 years ago. Okay? And our Creator will be there to support us and slowly rebuild what we've destroyed again. And we'll keep trying again in the future. I don't like that. I like to see us move forward to where we're supposed to be. And at the end of my history podcasts, I will discuss our spiritual podcasts and spirituality. And now I'm going to move over to an explanation of how I got here today. And mainly is I'm quite aware of the fact of as more people view these podcasts, I'm liable to receive more attacks. Okay? And therefore, I have to discuss where my credibility comes from. My credibility means a lot to me, and it means a lot to everybody around me. And that's important. And I plan to maintain my credibility. And that, as I said, is important. The most important thing in terms of credibility is I maintain the credibility for myself first. And if I do that, then it'll spread to everybody else around me. So, and as I mentioned before, I grew up and went through school and went to UC Berkeley and received a degree in zoology in 1968. I then went to UCLA School of Medicine and graduated there in 1972. After that, I took my postgraduate training at Bridgeport Hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Bridgeport Hospital was an affiliate with Yale School of Medicine. After that, I worked for a year at Olive View, Mid-Valley, at LA County Clinic, followed by 2.5 years in the Navy. Now, this I don't like to talk about very much. It was a rough time, not because it was the Navy. Nonsense. I actually liked being in the Navy. It was an adventure. But what happened was, while I was stationed on Okinawa as the medical officer for a Seabee battalion, towards the end of the deployment, which ended on June 1st, 1975, I started getting bizarre sensory symptoms in my head and all over my body, including my spine, both from cervical all the way down to the sacral at the bottom. And I was floored. I didn't know what to do. So when I finally got home, I tried to seek help, medical help, from my colleagues at Port Hueneme, which had a hospital in those days. They all thought I was lying to get out of the Navy, to get money, whatever. And they finally someone said, well, all your symptoms, we got to send you to a neurologist, which they did in Long Beach. And he said he thought it was more serious, and he sent me to see a neurosurgeon at Balboa Hospital in San Diego. The neurosurgeon, couldn't find anything because a lot of the neurological exams that are done were negative for any pathology. So he finally said, well, I want you to go see this neurologist. He just came in from Bethesda. He's been in the Navy 12 years. He's going to be chief of neurology here, and he'll probably be staying here until he retires, which is common in the military. So his name was Evans Diamond, and for him I am eternally grateful. He gave me the proper objective evaluation that I needed. He also asked me after the first visit, do you mind seeing a psychiatrist? Not at all. I told him, no, not at all. Because of the fact that if a psychiatrist can decide I've got a mental disorder and wants to give me medication that'll make it better, believe me, I will take it. I won't stop. And so he sent me. The psychiatrist asked me questions, interviewed me for an hour, raised his eyebrows and said, there's nothing in you mentally or in your personality that would lead to this symptom complex showing up. Okay? Whatever it is medical. And I'll write the opinion. And he did. He sat down there and wrote out the opinion. Sent it back to the neurologist who read it, looked it over, and said, finally, I think, he says, my opinion is that you have the beginnings of a peripheral neuropathy. It is both sensory and motor. And he says there's no test for it, and it's very uncommon, and there's no treatment for it. It could also, and he listed some, and he also said it can be MS, especially the fact that my mother had been diagnosed with MS. And apparently the MS runs in families. All I could say is I hope not. But he says the only thing we can do is give you a medical discharge. He recommended a 20% medical discharge. I ended up with 10%. And that was that. And I didn't know what to do. I realized I had to find, as much as I would ache by the end of the day or have weird symptoms sensory-wise around my head and my tongue would burn. But I knew I had to go on. I had a family and I had to support them. So I started off, I figured, well, if I can have a rigid schedule without phone calls and night calls. So I became an emergency room physician at a very busy emergency room in Southern California, the San Fernando Valley, and did well at it. The only problem, after about 15 months, I was exhausted beyond belief, which is what happens when people have sensory neuropathies. Your body can't handle that, and it wears out much more rapidly than normal. And at that time, when I realized I had no choice but to quit the emergency room, an opportunity for family practice came up and I took it, and it was a good one. And I remained in family practice for 16 years, after which, about 15 years later, I deteriorated again. And what happened at that point is I knew I couldn't go on. The exhaustion was so profound that all I could do was go to bed at 7 o'clock at night, get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and always feel tired. That was it. And then I developed an irregular heartbeat towards the end of 1993 and read in one of my journal articles that 5% of the people with peripheral neuropathies will suffer cardiac arrest and death on an annual basis, which means that out of 5% is 1 out of 20. Okay? That means 1 out of 20 of the people who have peripheral neuropathy will have a cardiac arrest and die suddenly. And I tried to ignore that. And then I realized I had a irregular heartbeat. And the irregular heartbeat sometimes was associated with death because it comes from other things too, not just neuropathies. And I started thinking about it. I said, crap, the busiest time of the year is ahead of me. This was in November now, and I'll never make it. This irregularity just seems to be there all the time. So my doctors agreed. I had two, the neurologist and a physical medicine specialist known as a physiatrist, not a psychiatrist, a physiatrist. And they both agreed, yes, under those circumstances, you have to retire. So I did. And after that, I wasn't sure what to do and with myself. And it took a while. This is not an easy thing to do. And once I did, I slowly adapted to it. My marriage ended, and at that point, I decided that I had to share what energy I had with my daughter, and she was just starting high school. So that I did. Now, what else that establishes my credibility? Now that you know the basics. Well, first of all, working in the county clinic helped a lot. It was a good place to work in those days. And in fact, Olive, which is his name, was trying to build itself up and affiliated with UCLA, which was my old medical school. So I got to know a lot of the people and did a lot of things, including teaching family nurse practitioners and nurse practitioners in general, which UCLA thought were useless. Okay. But since we were building an affiliate with them, we convinced them to take two of the nurse practitioners I trained. And lo and behold, after that, I had to go to the Navy. And I came back briefly to all of you after the Navy. And it was funny because when I came back, I asked what happened with the nurse practitioners in the program. Well, it's going great. Why? After a year, the UCLA group wanted 6 more, and they couldn't get along without them. Okay, now I knew that would happen. At least I hoped that would happen. I knew there was a good chance it could happen, but I was quite proud of that. And then I went to Northridge and learned a lot about emergency medicine, but I also got subpoenaed a lot to go to court and act as an expert witness, as in a variety of situations, including once in a while they needed someone to back up the fact that an individual was driving under the influence. And sometimes they're quite slippery and have slippery attorneys. And in the end, they tried to not always, in fact, rarely did I do that, go to court to testify why they were under the influence. And they were. So they all lost their case. That was about, I had to go to court maybe 12 times, but it wasn't just DUIs. There was once where it was about a fire captain that beat his wife, and that was a very rigid hearing. It was, what else? After 50 years, it's hard to remember what else was. So, but that was an education in and of itself. And I was happy with that because it did help me. And I ended up in court and learning to handle myself in a courtroom as an expert witness, when inside I didn't feel like an expert witness, okay? Did a lot for my self-confidence and my experience and my integrity, because I had to go through these issues before I testified. and make sure I was comfortable with what I was saying. And after that, when I left Northridge, I then got into family practice, which is what I'd wanted all along. And in those days, I had never quite finished my family practice residency. But in 1978, all you needed was an internship, and you could hang out a shingle as a family practitioner. And I joined the family practice department. That kind of annoyed me. Even though I hadn't done it, I knew that was coming in the future. And the knowledge to make a good family practitioner is going to take at least 3 years. Now, before that, I left out the Navy, okay, and what it taught me. And this is important. When I joined MCB 40, they had a new commanding officer. The previous CO had been removed for cause because there was a lot of disciplinary problems within the group, the battalion. And the new CO was ordered, his job was to straighten up the battalion. And so when we got to Okinawa, this was October 1st, 1974, he had a leadership class, okay? Ordered all officers and chiefs to go. Now, technically, I didn't have to go, but I was looking forward to learning what leadership looked like in the Navy. That was conducted 1 hour a week for 10 weeks. It was on Monday afternoon. At the end of the workday, all the chiefs and officers had to report for the class at 4 o'clock. It turned out to be one of the best postgraduate classes I ever took. I was amazed that the Navy could have such a good leadership class. And I realized at the time, well, of course they would have a good leadership class, because when you take a ship, even if it's even more in the old days where they were wind driven before anybody came up with the mechanical stuff, they were out at sea for months at a time. And if anything rocked discipline out at sea, it would destroy the whole ship. And occasionally it almost ruined a couple careers. So, but the hallmark, I can't remember a lot of the details, but the hallmark that I learned and what I've lived by ever since is that was a leader must do everything he orders the people under him and around him to do. If he doesn't, he sets out a group of orders, then goes off and does whatever the hell he wants that might violate those orders. Discipline then falls apart. And there's no discipline on that ship. Got that? Well, that's a ship. Just think of the same, just think of the United States as a ship of state. Okay, and when the leader passes out all these rules and they have to live by the Constitution and all that stuff, he has to himself live and conduct his business and life using the same rules. Because if he does not, everything falls apart. And unfortunately, today is a classic example of what happens when the leader violates those rules. Okay, it used to happen in ships on the high seas when the ships are out there for 4, 5, 6 months. And the Navy had to establish a routine, a proper routine, so that the men would follow the orders of the CO and maintain discipline. Okay, and they did. And you can see it in today's Navy. They've done a good job. And as I said, I was impressed. There are more things I learned, obviously, for 10 hours. But this one was the first, and it stuck with me. Okay? And then you got into some of the other things which I wish I could remember, but at this point I can't. All right? This being the most important. But it's the most important because it's real. It always happens when it isn't followed, period. And in the Navy, they couldn't allow for that. When the previous CEO had not followed this and the discipline in the battalion started falling apart, the Navy removed him and put a new guy in with orders to restore discipline. And he did. The guy was a good guy. I liked our CO. And However, my problems began with the neuropathy. And as my neuropathy, once I realized, my God, I can't, as much as I would have liked to go on our second deployment, I couldn't. I couldn't function in the Navy way with the symptoms of my neuropathy, which is why I pushed and got a medical discharge. And after that, I eventually got into my practice, and I really thrive with that. There are special things that came to me. It's the only way I can say it. They happened, and I accepted them. First and foremost, a pharmacist friend said, "Hey, there's a nursing home, a skilled nursing facility up here. They need a doctor to go to their meetings once a month, and the utilization and review committee meetings once a month, which basically is just a busy work meeting. And it's a lot. It has to do with the rules and regulations that the nursing home lives by in terms of patient care, nursing staff, etc. This group, this particular nursing home was run by a group of nuns, an order of nuns in Spain. So they all spoke Spanish, but when they came to stay here in Thousand Oaks, they also had to speak English. Okay. I worked with them for 13 years, all the way, even though my neuropathy was causing me to fail, because the spiritual approach that they used was fantastic. Okay. I liked them enough and I liked working with them, which surprised me. And what happened was, they used to, when patients came in from out of town without a physician, the administrator and the head nurse would give them to me. And initially I felt, boy, these nuns are tough. You know, they're hard on people. And I was a little nervous about it. And I remember talking to the administrator about it. He laughed. He says, don't let it get you. You just wait and see. Okay, so I waited and see. And I discovered that every single patient I had picked up at the skilled nursing facility, uh, got better. If they came in with lifelong history of depression, that depression began to lift and they could talk normally. I mean, there were so many things I was awed by because of this approach. I felt spiritually connected to them. Now, mind you, I'm not a Catholic. I'm Jewish, and I'm happy being Jewish. You know, had no desire to become a Catholic. And that was fine, but it was like a connection, a spiritual thing that had nothing to do with the religion. I don't know how to describe it. So I stayed with them for the 13 years until I had to retire. And the interesting thing, we had a number of cases that required a spiritual understanding. All right. And they respected that because basically we had the same spiritual understanding and it worked. In addition to that, okay, I joined a fledgling hospice in 79. And I'd wanted to do that because I made a decision as a medical student on the wards when I saw patients dying with cancer with no organized approach to cancer and the approaching death. It was shocking to me. It was inhuman. And the doctors couldn't do anything. People at the UCLA that were in charge of the wards, a lot of the patients had primary physicians outside of UCLA. And it was incredible. They got no help from the primary physicians. They just were basically warehoused at a place like UCLA. Are you kidding? The same was true at Wadsworth, VA. Now, this is back in the mid 70s, all right? Actually, it was earlier than this. This is back in the late 70s, late 60s, and it was in 1970 that I was on the wards. So when I went into practice, I went to hear a lady by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who came through town and gave a talk. Now, I had read her books prior to that because there'd been talk about hospice before 78. And I was determined that if I could work with a hospice and there was one in town, I would. Basically, I would volunteer my time. And all of the time until I no longer could work with the hospice was donated voluntarily. I felt it was part of my responsibility as a physician in town to do things like this. And initially, I became its medical director for 7 years. I also was on the board, and I stayed with them. By the time I had to retire, I could no longer do things like be a medical director, but I could go to board meetings, which was 1 hour once a month. And I could go to the staff meetings, uh, which was which was supposed to be 2 hours twice a month. Okay. And that was it, time wise. It was good. The staff was well trained. They knew what to look for. Hospice has become accepted in a short time since 1978, 79. Now it was, well, it was a little bit longer, 1993 or 94. But uh, it became important to me because once I had to retire, it was like, what am I going to do? I'm too active. My mind is too active to retire. So, but I continued, I had enough continuing with hospice and including, I continued with the tumor committee at the hospital, which was met every week to discuss difficult cancer patients so that I could then translate what I learned about the approaches to cancer patients to the staff at the staff meetings. And that's what I did. And the staff was very good and very well trained, what we had. But eventually the law changed. And because we were volunteer hospice, we never charged our patients anything. We had to fundraise. Boy, that was tough, let me tell you. And so eventually the laws changed. And because we were volunteer hospice, we couldn't do 2/3 of the things we had been doing. Okay. And people griped about it, but we maintained our nurses because I saw ourselves, and so did they, everybody else, as an adjunct to the pay for the private hospices that charge fees and work with Medicare. And we did. We were a very good adjunct and had a good reputation. Whereas in other towns, uh, the private hospices would look down on volunteer hospices or get angry because they felt they were competition, would take business away. We never did that. I was firm on that one, and the people on the board listened to me. We help people. We aid people. Nobody here wants to hire a social worker and another nurse and someone for billing with Medicare and Medi-Cal. And the board was dead set against it, which is okay with me. I was part of the board and I presented all the data about what it would take to become a private pay hospices. And the board members didn't like it. And I didn't either. So I threw my vote in as chairman of that committee to support that. Because you can't run a hospice if you don't have support of a board, a good board. There are plenty that have bad boards. I won't go into those. So we were able to maintain ourselves. What we had to concentrate on was bereavement and grief. And we had grief groups for every age, man, every age, from age 5 to age 85. And in my opinion, because I was a family practitioner, the most important grief groups we had were the pediatric groups. And they were divided in two categories. First, the 5-year-olds to the 11, 12-year-olds, and then the 12, 13-year-olds to the 19-year-olds. And they overlapped. There were some kids who could graduate into the older group at the age of 10. And there are other kids who couldn't and had to stay with the younger group until they were 13 or 14. But our group thrived. We had incredible people uh, running the groups. And I learned all about grief, the grief reaction, and bereavement during my time with Hospice of Canale, which, believe it or not, was 41 years. And I'm quite comfortable in understanding all of those things. And it's not easy, let me tell you. It's hard when people have to go through grief. And I learned also that grief is 100%. Nobody escapes it. When someone dies in your family, whether suddenly or from a disease, you go through grief. The period that you go through grief and readjust your life is known as the bereavement period. And there is no fixed time for that. It can be anywhere from 2 days, 2 months, 2 years, or some people it's their whole life. Okay? And the grief groups are designed for the people who can't adjust either in their houses of worship or with their family support, and to give them the support they need. And the grief groups were very important. And they still meet to this day, and they started off in 1977. Okay? And it's the people involved actually became very good experts on all forms of grief from all situations. And I'm not going to go into that because it takes too much time. However, it put me in a position where I understand those things. And over the years, with all the mass killings, including one here in Thousand Oaks back in 2018, and the deaths from fires, as well as occasional murder cases, we've been able to handle those and help people. The fact of the matter is, we were the only ones with experience in that. And that's, again, a long story, which I'm not going to go into. And I will later on in the next, when I do my first book podcast, but not now. And the last item for my credibility began in 1984. I had been reading the California Medical Association recommended that every private hospital in the state have a bioethics committee because people were tense going in the hospital and they didn't understand the situation and some of the conditions, not conditions, but the diseases conditions, not the hospitals, created a lot of grief and confusion and anguish in people. So I went to the chief of staff, who I knew was a friend, and I said, the CMA wants us to form grief committees or ethics committees. And he says, yeah, I know. He says, okay, we're going to start that. I'll tell the administrator in charge. And I went and talked with her too. And she sent me off. At that time, USC was conducting a day-long class on bioethics, which was very, very good. And we started the grief group. It started up. I became its chairman and remained its chairman until I could no longer practice. It's a very interesting thing. Most of the problems came into the grief group had to do with communications and straightening it out between nurses, doctors, clergy, lay personnel, and and once you did that, everything would settle down and people go away accepting of their situation because they understood what it was and where it came from, and that nobody was making it hard. The situation was hard for everybody, and that includes the nurses, the doctors, civilians that were on the committee, the clergy that was on the committee. We did something unusual. The book, the Bible that started this, is called Clinical Ethics, and it was written by a doctor, a clergy, and a lawyer. And in their view, it should have a lawyer. So when I took over as chairman and saying, well, what do you think? Do we need a lawyer? Should we have a lawyer? And everybody universally said no. Why? Because these are ethical conditions, medical conditions, psychological, whatnot. It has nothing to do with the law. But ethics in medicine has nothing to do with lawyers and legal. If we have a case where it is necessary to have a lawyer, the hospital can provide one, or we can get one in the community. But otherwise, no, keep the lawyers out. Now, I would have voted to have a lawyer, okay? And I'm telling you this because after 6 years, I could say, my God, the lawyer has no place in the legal situation when it comes to medical ethics because it should have nothing to do with the law. And if you get into one of those cases, such as withdrawing a feeding tube, which was tough in those days, and you got the lawyer to come in and give you advice. And that worked. And no lawyer ever complained about that in the city. Why? Because they would come in and do their thing and help us, and that satisfied them. And they had to do it for free, by the way. All membership, there's no gratuity for serving on the committee. And that's the only way we could be sure that everybody was honest and was interested in the subject. And it worked out very good. As far as I know, it's still meeting today, the Bioethics Committee. And I was real proud of that. But when I finally retired, it was like, okay, my position that I had accomplished in the medical community, first with being one of the leaders to Hospice of Caneo, second to be the initiator of the Bioethics Committee and later on its chairman, and being medical director for the nursing home, which is known as Mary Health of the Sick. And I was real proud of that because it all worked so well. And the difficulty of the cases was incredible. But when you sorted them through, they smoothed out. And I learned a lot. Believe me, I learned a lot. But uh, but that's where my integrity comes, okay? Because I had to take on tough cases with no remuneration because I felt it was my responsibility to take care of my community in any way I could. And because I was so limited with my neuropathy, I couldn't do that anymore. So the best thing I could do was the way I did it. And that brings me to the end of why integrity is important to me. It always has been important to me. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but from my position as a physician and a human being now, and a historian, because during the 30 years I retired, I had to find something. I learned how to be an artist with my first computer, by scanning postage stamps into Adobe Photoshop, and then working with them and come out with really nice works of art you could put on your wall and frame and mat. That lasted about 7 years and it faded because the disease continued to get worse and I could no longer even do that. And then what I always have been doing since 1990 was getting caught up in the History Channel. History Channel was a spinoff from A&E. And they had a commitment. It was spiritual. They put out the most incredible library of documentaries about Civil War, World War I, Revolution, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and all that came later. I was amazed because I was fascinated by this. And then they came out with the same amount of documents for the in-between times, the peaceful times, and I watched them all. Finally, they started doing documentaries from outside the United States, and I learned about some of the Chinese philosophers like uh, Lao Tzu and Sun Tzu, who did The Art of War, and Confucius, and Siddhartha Gautama, who was known as the Buddha. And that was fascinating. I even, watched a 4-hour document on Genghis Khan and found his life really interesting. And also I realized the ugly violence of the China area when Genghis Khan was alive. And it was rough there, let me tell you. So was Japan. I learned about the shoguns. But anyway, as I learned about it, I began to see similarities. And I began to realize, my God, the attitude of all these people just seems so unchanged over the last 2,000 years. And I wonder why. So I started studying for that. And it finally started to come together, about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. First, it came together with science from the biological world and the genetics world. Basically, it's from the genetics world. And by 2000, the genetic genome, or our DNA and our chromosomes, had been mapped. This is an incredible feat. The numbers are beyond imagination. But they did it. And it was a team effort. And by team, I mean all of the free world countries and anybody who wanted to participate in it, which turned out to be a lot. The major countries, of course, Canada, uh, Mexico, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan, India. I'm not sure if China was scientifically enmeshed and agreeable with the world at that point. But by the year 2000, it was done. The only problem is, yeah, you had all these genes mapped, but you didn't know what the heck they did. Okay. And then that began the next step of work. And that has been ongoing. It's still a team effort, has to be. The quantity of molecules in our chromosome is unbelievable. And to get this all to work and to understand it takes a lot of computer time and a lot of computer space. And only because the speed and size of our hard drives increasing so much has made us able to do that. I just want to put that in so you know it doesn't happen by magic. Okay. You might think it's magic. In a way, what we can do with our computers today does seem to be magic, but it wasn't magic. All right. What has been discovered has been more of our personalities are coded in our DNA than anybody ever thought before. Got that? I'll try and explain it. That means who we are is encoded in our DNA very often. Of course, it's modified by experience. Now, this has been a philosophical argument that's gone on forever. Okay, whether it's nature or nurture. In other words, are our personalities all created after we're born, or is it created before we're born? That get into the arguments over God. It's been a long time. And like anything, right now we don't know the extent of our personalities being encoded in our DNA, just that it is. And the research continues. It might be another 20 or 30 years before we can figure this out, or maybe even longer. But the fact that it is a major breakthrough. It is a breakthrough in understanding how human nature works. It is a breakthrough that allows us to use history as a daily tool for what's going on in people's heads today. In the past, history's been dead. People have been dead. Those are different societies. They work differently than ours did. So it's nice to know, and we have to know. But the fact of the matter is, with this new knowledge, it means the people were the same thousands of years ago than they are today. How? We are born as a blank slate, as you know. Babies can't think, they can't do anything, and it takes about 20 years to reach the adult stability. And that's fine. But it was the same way 5,000 years ago. It was the same way 25,000 years ago. And there are other factors that limited what went on. For example, diseases knocked off half the human race before they got to become adults. Uh, Disease and childbirth related problems knocked off the female part of the human race much greater than you would think. Maternal mortality and death due to other maternal causes was one third, 33%. That means that every three women born, one would die as a result of childbirth and childbirth related problems. That limited the ability of societies to move forward. And it took a very long time before to wind up and start to do that. So therefore, someone born at the time of, let's say, Julius Caesar or Adolf Hitler, or going back even further than that, to Abraham and beyond, all were born the same way as we are born today. The amount of genes in the human genome have been pretty much the same as they were 100,000 years ago. Okay? They've just been mixed more and more. And you can get philosophical in the history part. I'm going to discuss that because as they are isolated and people grew in this era, in fact, since 1776, people are coming back together. And as they come back together, they're bringing their genes with them, which strengthens the population as a whole. The more genes you have to work with, the less chance you have of getting genes that cause diseases that are life limiting and fatal. And that's important. It's important to the survival of the human race, period. There is no argument about that. That's why we have people from Asia, people from Africa, people from the Middle East, people from China, India, and Europe, all working together in this country. Yeah, we're putting up with a lot of ignorance that causes racism and other problems. But the fact of the matter is, think about it. Our Creator put us here, and our Creator put us to mix the people, the population, and science proves that. Okay? So, with that, it's important to understand. Now, we can look at, say, the dictator's life. We'll go back to let's say, a revolution. And we'll start with Aaron Burr. We'll start with Thomas Conway. We'll move on to other places, such as Maximilien Robespierre in France. Then we go further on. We've got Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Hideki Tojo, and Mao Zedong. And then at the end of the 20th century, we had the advent of Syed Khamenei in Iran. And now we have to deal with Vladimir Putin and Syed Khamenei's people that are taking over. So, all of them exhibit the same personality and the way they approach life. And the one thing I want to tell you is when you're in medicine and you make a choice of specialties as a student, what you find is how do you choose your specialty and why we have specialties. Okay? In medicine, it's complex, and you can't have good specialty training unless you just concentrate on one segment of the diseases that you see, such as gastroenterology, pulmonology, neurology, and then surgeons that go with them, pneumonias, heart disease. So you have to specialize. Why? Because the more of those cases you see, the better you get at both diagnosis and treatment of those diseases. You get people like me, who I find all of those diseases interesting in me, and I happy being the family practitioner and gatekeeper. And what you see, therefore, is evaluating. Now that we know that psychologically people don't change, and that's been proven partially by our genetics research, we can then go back and look at all these dictators, look at their behavior patterns, and then transfer that knowledge to today, and it is valid to see the personality of dictator wannabes as they start to come up into their countries. Okay, and we know where they're going to go. And because of that, I know exactly where Donald Trump is going to go. Why? Because I guess you can say I've had specialty training in dictator history. That's like a subspecialty of the total history. Okay? Same way cardiology is a subspecialty of medicine. Got that? The more experience you get, the more I read, the more I learn about people who are dictators and the types of government that exist in the past, the more I can see what's going on today and understand where it's coming from. It is important to know the genetics of the behavior of dictators. And it's simple and it's real. Now, it's not so simple that you know the whole problem. No, they all have variations that they've grown up with. And but the basic things that controls everybody is that personality disorder present in the dictators. It is narcissistic, sociopathic personality disorder of a severe nature. Some people could say it's a narcissistic, psychopathic personality disorder of a severe nature. Now, as I said, the splits between sociopathy and psychopathy is not really easy to see. I've looked in dictionaries and tried to figure it out. But the best I could find out was a psychopath will kill people for whatever reason they like to kill people. They have fun doing it, whatever the reason is. And that's a dividing line. Sociopaths have no conscience, just like the psychopath. They have no compassion towards anybody but themselves. But on the other hand, they'll do everything they can to make for themselves. But they usually don't cross that line and kill people. Okay? Maybe, and that's the only way to determine which one is which. So that's as I said, that's why I know where Donald Trump's going. Every one of the dictators I've talked about all reach a point where they deteriorate as they get older because there's no treatment. And like today, they wouldn't take the treatment if it was offered to them. And as a result, they start deteriorating and they're depressed and they look around to do things that'll relieve their depression. And war excites them, turns them on. It's 100%. Okay? If they have the ability to make war, they will do it. Okay? And that's what is scary about where we are with Donald Trump. He has the ability to make war. Now he's done it against Venezuela. Now he started a total war against Iran. And if that doesn't satisfy him when it seems to peter out, he'll figure out another way to go after somebody. Maybe it'll be Mexico, maybe it'll be Canada. And maybe he will finally clash with Putin and Russia, and he'll end up with a war between Russia and the United States. Okay, those things are unpredictable. But the fact that it's going that direction is predictable, and it will continue. It will not stop until everything explodes and goes over. And if you're wondering what everything exploding going over looks like, just go back to World War II and World War I. Then you'll know. And that's the problem we are facing now. That's why we have to bust our buns for the coming election in November to put people in the government, in Congress, that will not tolerate this. And this is not Republican over Democrat. And I want you to understand that the people that are referring to themselves as Republicans aren't Republicans anymore. They're all trying to convert our government into this dictatorship that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin want for us. And that has got to stop. And a lot of the Republicans that voted for Donald Trump in 2024 have got to accept this, whether they like it or not. Because if they don't, we're going to deteriorate more. And it will mean an end possibly to our democracy and our way of life. But it will happen unless they stand up with everybody else and vote against it. It's not a party thing. It's not anything like it. This is a life's decision, a governmental thing for all of us. And we all have to accept that and work for it to fix it. Get rid of the ones that are in power, like we did in 1776. We got rid of King George III and his parliament, and we developed our independence. And it looks like we're going to have to do the same today. Okay, but as I said, we want to work within our Constitution, within our election process to win this battle. Okay, that's the most important thing. Now, if we can't do that, and if too many people want to stay on the other side because they think we're the enemy and they're going to win, it could deteriorate to a physical, violent war. But it will deteriorate because computer wars, hacking, all of it will be involved. And that, folks, is going to be one hell of a mess. So that's what we're working for. That's what you all are working for. As I said, without the will of everybody getting behind that, we're going to lose. And if you're wondering about that, just think of World War II. Just think of December 8th, 1941, and Roosevelt making his lecture, and what happened after that. Everybody came together. There was no more Democrat, Republicans. They all had to work. They all had to suffer with less food, less gasoline, no new cars for 4 to 5 years. And they did it. And they did not complain because they knew what was at stake. And that's what we have. That's where we have to be now. I don't know what it's going to take, but we're suffering the side effects of this dictatorship, and it'll get worse. And cars are more expensive. Our economy inflation rate is ridiculous now, and it will become out of control. And then the economy will fail like it did in 1929, whether we like it or not. And as it did in 2007. Okay, there's no difference. Same thing, and we don't want that. We don't need to have it, but we can, and we need to stop it, and we can do all of that. We are, all the tools we need are right there in front of us, and we can do that. We just have to make up our minds how we're going to use them. And we're all going to have to use them together, universally. This isn't a party political thing. This is an attack on a system by a small group of people who want to take over our government. And it is a war. Until they start negotiating seriously or back off, we're still in a state of war. And that's the way it is. I remember thinking years ago, well, what would happen if we had trouble like that? What would I do? Okay, and I started thinking about it, and I decided, you know what? I'd rather be at Disneyland any day of the week if something like that happened, but I couldn't. I would join and I would fight. Now, I'm not doing much more than these podcasts, which is the reason. Physically, medically, health wise, I am homebound, wheelchair bound, and require a caregiver 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as I said, I can't leave the house. But damn it, with today's computers, I still have I can still talk, and I can still do my podcast. And I taught myself in the last 4 months how to organize, with the help of others, my podcast. And I want to thank Riverside FM. Signing with them has helped me a lot. I don't think I could have done it without that. They're good at organizing these things. And that's the way it is. I can't join politics. I think if I didn't have my neuropathy and it had gone this direction, I'd probably, be part of the Democratic committees of our community. But I can't. I don't have the stamina or the physical ability to do that, and or to do anything else. So I do what I can do, and I'm grateful to the fact that my disease, my neurological disease, has left my heart intact, my lungs intact, and most importantly, my brain intact. And at least according to everybody around me, they say I show no sign of senility or Alzheimer's disease. And I am grateful for that. That's what's important. So I can do this, and I will continue to do this. And although I want to move over to history, anything that pops up, I will stop and do this podcast. And I will close now by giving you some examples of how to fight, how to keep yourself current in a real world with what Trump's doing. Okay, people who have mental diseases, especially like Trump, when they speak, they give us tells every single day. Okay, and Trump, he starts talking in one place on one subject. He may stop in mid-sentence. He may throw in a word that we never heard of before. or he may change topics suddenly on you. These are tells that tell you that there's a major thought disorder going on inside, and they have a mental disease. He tells, to make a joke, but he tells all, and he sure does. All these crazy things people are confused about. Well, guess what? They are crazy things because they're not mentally competent. They are confusing because the man's mind is confusing. And it's, I was taught once in psychiatry as a junior from an attending psychiatrist who'd been an internist. And he was telling us when you see a patient and if you interview them from a psychological or psychiatric point of view, he says, you use the back of your neck to tell you where the guy's at, how crazy he is. And in a one on one situation, psychiatry, of course, this doesn't really apply to the situation today. But on a one on one situation, he said, if the hair on the back of his neck stood up and he suddenly felt fear, he could transfer, he said, reliably, he could transfer that back to the patient and know that's the way the patient felt. And he could do it with all kinds of things. That's just a trick people in psychology and psychiatry use. I've never been able to use that, but I pass it on for what it's worth. Anyway, I will now close and say thank you. Bye bye.